right. Good evening, gentlemen. We are continuing hot on the heels with Chassidic passion. We are continuing on last week's class. During last week's class, we said that this week, God willing, we're going to finish chapter 10. I hope to hold to that prediction. I hope tonight we are going to finish chapter 10 of the Holy Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. And like I also mentioned last week, chapter 11 and chapter 12 are going to go pretty quickly. In other words, this chapter 10 was our last blockbuster chapter, our last many-class chapter. We're going to finish chapter 11 and chapter 12, God willing, and then we are going to begin our next adventure, our next project. We are discussing discussing how God's wisdom is actually a pure expression of godliness. It's not really wisdom at all, right? God has something called wisdom. He emanates his wisdom. His wisdom is an expression of him. How is it an expression of him? What do we mean by that? We mean like it's a ray of the sun in the sun. In other words, we mean that his wisdom is not really eile b'shem. It does not deserve its own name at all. There is not really one thing that you could point to and say, this is God's wisdom. All there really is godliness, the infinite expression of Hashem, a God who we must remind ourselves is infinitely beyond wisdom, right? In other words, the God who is totally unrelated to wisdom, who cannot be expressed through wisdom, is expressed through the divine wisdom, which, even though it is the divine wisdom, is nothing other than godliness, is nothing other than an expression of God himself. And we finished our class last week with a question. The question was, so why call it wisdom at all, right? In other words, in what sense does God have wisdom? In truth, God's wisdom is indistinguishable from God's kindness, right? Or God's discipline, God's authority, right? God's majesty, God's will. All of these different divine traits, right, are also just pure experiences of the divine infinitude. They are all just expressions of God as he is infinitely beyond definition, right? Now, how can you be mechalik? How can you divide between an infinite expression of God and an infinite expression of God? And the answer is that really you can't. Really you cannot divide between these two things. If all that the divine traits are infinite expressions of God, then there really is no difference between chachma and chesed, between wisdom and kindness. Why would there be a difference? They are different names for the same thing, right? How could you say that this thing is defined as wisdom? This is where this thing ends, it exists within these boundaries, and that's wisdom. Whereas this other thing ends and it exists within these other boundaries, and that's kindness, right? How could you say such a thing? In other words, that would imply that there is something in the divine wisdom which is separate from Hashem, right? Which has its own nature, its own identity, that would tell you where to draw that line. But as we've just spent a great amount of time and effort explaining, there is nothing to teach us where to draw that line, right? There is no aspect of the divine wisdom that makes it wisdom rather than kindness, right? There is nothing finite or defining or lending to division or multiplicity about the divine wisdom. All it is part of Hashem's infinite expression of himself. And if that's the case, what's the difference between the divine wisdom and the divine kindness? The divine kindness is the exact same. It's just part of the infinite expression of the divine self, infinite expression of God. And the answer that we gave is, indeed, this is the truth. The truth is that from God's perspective, there is no differentiating between his wisdom and his kindness. Why then do we differentiate between his wisdom and his kindness? Because from the perspective of the creation, of that which is created through his wisdom and kindness and will and all of his other traits, from the perspective of the creation, these things are different, right? And we said in three ways. In three ways the differences in these things affect the creation. And these three ways really encompass everything about the creation. There's very little about the creation left once you get done with these three ways. In other words, these three things are incredibly important to the creation. Why? Number one, what are the three things? Again, these are the three ways that the differences between the divine traits affect the creation. The first way is that the differences between the divine traits affect our creation in the first place. The 6 days of creation, or the 7 days of creation, however you want to call them, correspond to 6 or 7 different divine traits. Right? And it is the differences in those traits that dictate the order and the way in which everything is created. Light is created on the first day because that's the day of chesed, the day of kindness. Division, the separating, the firmament separating the heavenly waters from the physical waters. This division, this firmament is created on the second day. Right? The first day is light, the second day is separation, chesed and gvura. So the differences between the divine traits, the difference between the divine trait of kindness and the divine trait of the difference between the divine trait of kindness and the divine trait of severity, separation, distance, withholding can be found in the different things that are created on the first and second day. The second way in which the differences between the divine traits affect the creation is that they affect the very soul, the very chayus, the very nature of the creation. In other words, the example I think we used last week is that milk corresponds to the divine chesed and meat corresponds to the divine gvura. In other words, different creations in their varying natures, their natures reflect the divine multiplicity. Milk does not have the same nature as meat. A frog does not have the same nature as an elephant or a tree or a rock. The differences in these natures reflect differences in the divine traits. Different combinations, different expressions of these different divine traits. So you have the very fact that the thing exists comes through the divine traits. You have the very nature or essence of the thing, the soul of the thing comes through the divine traits. And the third thing is hanhaga, the way that God deals with the world is also through these divine traits. For example, the first 1,000 years were a year of kindness. The second 1,000 years after Adam were years of punishment, gvura, severity, right? Or we say that there are certain times like Rosh Hashanah where God sits himself on the chair of mercy rather than the chair of judgment, right? He relates to the creation through his different traits, right? So we have the very existence of the creations, you have their essence, and you have the way God deals with them. In other words, nearly everything about them, right? Most things that we think of when we think of a creation all come through these divine traits. Therefore, from the perspective of the creation, those divine traits are important, right? In other words, it is really it's really what we'd call an idea in Chassidus of Yeshus. It's an idea of independent being, a thing being itself. In other words, for the frog to be itself, or the tree to be itself, right? Everything, all the creations are created with a sense that they themselves, and only themselves, are themselves. Which doesn't seem like such a dramatic thing to say, right? But the truth is that the frog's tendency to be a frog and not anything else, right? Which is the fundamental baseline of all reality as we know it, right? That things are themselves, essentially, right? The idea that a thing should be itself necessitates that it perceives the divine traits through which it is created as real and individual, right? In other words, for a frog to be itself, the frog is always saying, my nature is that of a frog, not that of a tree, right? In order for there to be a way to differentiate between the frog and the tree, there must be divine traits in multiplicity. In other words, that division has to come from somewhere. That division has to have a basis in reality. So God, who is one, does not need the spheres to be different, right? I'm saying it almost sounds psychological, although really we're speaking metaphysically and existentially. But God doesn't need the divine traits to all be different one from the other, because God is absolutely one, and God, unlike everything else, is himself only by being himself. A frog is a frog by being green and hopping, right? If the tree is brown and doesn't hop, it can't be a frog, right? What makes God God? It's not a color. It's not a behavior. If you go through the whole list, right, and this is how, as we read, if we read all the midrashim and all the commentaries if we'll read the end of this week's parsha, the beginning of next week's parsha, this is how Avraham Avinu discovers God. Abraham discovers God. He says there must be something which doesn't change, which doesn't have all of these defined and mutable traits, the things that change, things that come and go, things that are manipulable and defined, right? There must be something which underlies all these things, and that thing must be defined as infinite, unchanging, and existing, being defined only in terms of itself, right? And that's what God is. So in other words, I know I'm getting very off track, but the point is that the reason the creation needs to see, it's really a chicken or the egg question, because the creation is created this way by this process. So in other words, they need each other. It goes together. But the reason the creation sees multiplicity is because for a yesh, for a being, for a self, who is a self not on his own terms. Only God is a true self, a true yesh, a true independent being. Everything else is dependent. The frog is dependent on the color green. It's dependent on the concept of hopping, right, etc., etc. It's dependent on its parents as well, in a different way, right? It's dependent on many, many things, food, water. Everything that exists is other than God is dependent, right? By being dependent, what that means is that in order to be itself, it needs multiplicity. It needs diversity, right? For a frog to be a frog, there has to be multiplicity. There has to be hopping as opposed to sitting still. There has to be green instead of brown, right? For example. Therefore, when you see it this way, you understand why all of the creations, from the smallest physical atom up to the created angels in the world of Bria, all of them require the differences in the divine traits. They need to see the differences in the divine traits because they perceive that as the source of their very self. Right? If they were to lose that sense of the divine traits, what would happen to them? They would lose their sense of self, which is why the highest angels with the deepest perception are called srafim, which means the ones who burn, because every day those angels perceive their source in the divine unity, and they lose all sense of their own being. They burn away, right? If you truly perceive the truth of the divine traits, which is that there is no multiplicity and that there really is no difference between you the created being, and a tree, right? Between your body and the body of a tree, let's say, because the neshama is very special, as always. The soul, the nefesh elokis, especially the godly soul, is very special. But let's distinguish between your body and the body of a tree or the body of a frog. If you were to perceive the divine traits as God perceives them, what would happen? You would simply lose yourself in that unity, as happens to the angels, right? So for everything to remain itself, which is God's intention for the creation, his intention for the creation is that things should actually be created, not that he should do something and then it should instantly collapse on itself and burn up into nothingness, right? He wants that things should actually remain created. In order to remain created, in order to be, if you're not God, right, there has to be a certain lie that is sustained. And the lie that is sustained is the lie of the differing divine traits. That's the baseline perception that has to be kept up, a perception of the difference in the divine traits, right? There's a lot more to say on this topic, but we'll leave it there. What it is like, if you'd like to use a metaphor that we've used in this class already in the past, it's like the colored cups, right? Remember, you have water which has no color, and it's poured into cups of different color. You have glass cups, right? You have a green glass cup, a red glass cup, and a blue glass cup. And you pour water, which has no color, into each of these three cups, right? The creation is always standing on the outside, right? We see water. In other words, we can perceive godliness. We can perceive the thing that is the source of the world. But how do we always perceive him? We perceive him as through different colored lenses, right? There's different divine traits. There's different manifestations of the divine. We cannot really intellectually, by nature of our being created, we cannot collapse all these traits into one thing, right? In other words, I cannot see how the divine trait of wisdom is absolutely the same as the divine trait of kindness, and that neither of them are defined as wisdom or kindness. They're really just godliness, right? I can't see that. If I could see that, I would lose everything that I think makes me me. I would totally lose that reality. So I cannot see, I have not been allowed to see, would be the better way of putting it, the true nature of these things. So instead, I see red water, green water, and blue water. And I know that it's all water, in other words, that it's all God. They're all divine traits. But I see them as different from one another, right? God, so to speak, sees the water from within the glasses, so to speak. God sees how it's the same water in every cup, and it's really the exact same thing that is being perceived, with no difference whatsoever in the different realities. So that's the answer to the question. Why do we call one thing wisdom and one thing kindness when speaking of the divine wisdom and divine kindness? The answer is because that is legitimately our perspective. The perspective of the creation sees these 10 things or 10 traits, or however you want to put them. You could even expand the list a little bit if you get very liberal. But we see these different divine traits as being truly different, and thus as being inescapably different, irreducibly different. That is the perspective of the creation. In fact, at the final analysis, that is what makes the perspective of the creation the perspective of the creation. In other words, that is inherent to the creation's perspective. It's what makes it a different perspective from God's, right? But from God's perspective, when God looks at exactly those same traits, he looks at the divine wisdom, the divine kindness, he sees only an infinite expression of himself. He doesn't see a distinction between these two things at all. All that's there is luminary. It's like the two rays of the sun in the sun, right? All that's really here is the sun. All that's really here is the luminary. And so the Alter Rebbe is going to, let's read this inside. 964, page 964, the second line. Zog the Heilige Alter Rebbe, the Holy Alter Rebbe says, K'de Isa b'midrash. As the Midrash writes, Ba'asara dvarim nivra elam, with 10 things the world was created. B'chachma, betuna, uvedas chulu. Second line on 964. Third line, pardon me, on 964. Third line on 964. With 10 things that the world created. B'chachma, betuna, uvedas. With wisdom, understanding, and with knowledge. Right? This is actually what the Gemara says. The Gemara in Chagiga says, which is the Kabbalistic Masechta, by the way. Some of us may be interested in learning it, because it has all the roots for the hidden Torah in the revealed Torah are all in Masechtas Chagiga for whatever reason. So if you read Masechtas Chagiga, it says, with 10 things the world was created. Chachma, Tvuna, Das, etc. Right? It lists the 10 things, the 10 divine traits by which the world was created. In other words, what is the emphasis? The emphasis is that the distinction of the 10 things arises when? When God is sitting alone before the world is created? No. When the world is created, 10 different things arise. Right? In other words, the separation of the divine traits is vis-a-vis the creation of the world. It is by the creation of the world that the 10 things are become 10 distinct things. Dichsiv, as the verse says, last line on 964, B'chachma yesad aretz. With wisdom he founded the earth. Keinen shemayim betvuna. He established the heavens with understanding. B'daitei tehemes nivku. He breached the depths with his knowledge. The depths of the abyss were burst open, as the translation has it here. Right? In other words, the Gemara brings the verses that describe the 10 different means by which God created the world. And how are they differentiated? They're differentiated in God interacting with the creation. Right? When God establishes the heavens, it's with understanding, etc., etc. And then we have the more explicitly Kabbalistic phrasing, or the way the Kabbalah puts it, in the Tikkunei Zohar, right? Which says, top of 965, the Fikas Eser Tikkunim, you brought forth 10 garments, v'karinan lahen eser sviran, and you called them the 10 svirus. L'anhaga b'hein almin. Why did you do this? To rule over the world with them. Right? To relate to the world, you brought forth 10 things. Which worlds? Sesimin delay isgalin va'almin de isgalin. The worlds that are concealed and not revealed, and the worlds that are revealed. Right? Which in simple parlance means in the higher spiritual worlds and in the lower world, including our physical world. Right? In the hidden worlds and the concealed worlds. But why did God bring forth these 10 garments, which he calls 10 spheres, which are called 10 spheres, in order to deal with the world? And then what does it say? It says, Ubehoin is kasias chulu. And in them you are concealed. In other words, when God uses his wisdom, right? When God expresses his wisdom, is God revealed in his wisdom or concealed in his wisdom? And the answer is obviously both. It depends how you look at it. If you're God looking at his wisdom, then not only is he revealed in his wisdom, he is so revealed in his wisdom, it's hard to even understand why it's called wisdom. It's just a revelation of God. But if you are the creation as it relates to God's wisdom, then God is concealed in his wisdom, because we perceive something that can rightly be called wisdom as distinct from kindness, which means we perceive something which is finite in some way, or defined in some way, which means that we do not perceive God as he truly is within these things. Right? In other words, to put it in a slightly different language, when God uses his wisdom or expresses himself in his wisdom, right? He is, and that wisdom is then, and then the creation then sees that wisdom. That wisdom conceals the deeper truth of what it is, which is a mere infinite expression of God. And what it instead reveals is an external or a superficial aspect of the divine wisdom, which is that it's actually wisdom. That there is something called wisdom and that it is divine. Yeah, relatively clear.
Well, do we understand wisdom from God's perspective as we understand it from our perspective, which means generally sagaciousness, sagacity?
No, because wisdom, the divine wisdom from God's perspective is not defined. It's infinitely transcendent of intellect.
It's a word, then.
To us, yes, it's an issue. It's an issue, just like God is just a word. Right? If that word could be defined in any other terms, it wouldn't be God. It's part of the issue. It's part of the issue. In general, our definitions of God are all creation relative. In other words, God is the one from who the creation all came. Okay, but who's God though? You're just telling me what he did, but what is he? And the answer is that if I could answer that question, he wouldn't be God. So too, God's wisdom, that's exactly the point we're saying, that from God's perspective, his wisdom is just like him. That's exactly the point. His wisdom is as undefined as he is. It's just an expression of his infinitude which is beyond definition. Which is why, from his perspective, there's no dividing between his wisdom and his kindness, right? Because the wisdom and kindness pertain to the exact same reality. You can't distinguish between those two realities. It's only from the creation's perspective that these two things are different, right? To use the Alter Rebbe as a dramatic example, when we say that the sweetness of an apple comes from the divine kindness, and the bitterness of a bitter apple comes from the divine severity, right? We mean that there is something infinite and divine two things, I should say, that are infinite and divine. And yet in their difference between these two divine expressions, we find the roots of the difference between these two qualities that I can physically perceive in this world. Right? The very notion that there should be a multiplicity between the nature of a sweet apple and a bitter apple, right, comes from the creation's perception of the divine traits. In his perception of the divine traits, there is no difference between a sweet apple and a bitter apple whatsoever. The contradiction is from our perspective, right? And the roots of that contradiction are not merely physical, they find their roots all the way in Reim HaMailos, in the highest place, in the divine traits itself. From the creation, from the perspective of the creation, from a perspective of Yeshus, of an independent created being, an independent created being cannot reconcile the apparent contradiction between God's wisdom and God's kindness and God's severity. These are three different things. Even though I understand they're all gods, they're nevertheless different. Right? From God's perspective, these three things are all absolutely one with his own infinite expression. They're all three rays of light in the sun. All that's there is the sun. How are the different spheres used in the creation? The rest of the chapter essentially describes how the different spheres, the different divine traits, are used differently in the creation. So let's continue. Al derech mashal, we are 3 lines down on 965. Al derech mashal, for example, says the Holy Alter Rebbe, B'yom rishon m'sheshes yemei bereishis, on the first day of the 6 days of creation, Nigalis midas hachesed, is revealed the trait of kindness. Kulula mikol midas hakadoshis, including within it all of his divine traits. Right? What does he mean? He means that when he revealed his kindness, there was also severity within kindness and mercy within kindness, right? What we call gvura shebechesed, tiferes shebechesed, right? All, when he revealed the trait of kindness, it was kindness as it was inter-included with all the other divine traits, right? But nevertheless, it was kindness that he revealed. His will and his wisdom and his understanding and his knowledge, etc., were all invested within this kindness. And what did he do with this kindness? He created with it light, right? Let there be light. The first day of creation. But Maimer Yehiyar, right? Shehi bechinas his pashtus. Why was light created on the first day with the trait of kindness? Because light is hispashtus v'hamshachas ha'er la'ela milamayla. Light is an extension and a drawing down of light to the world from above, V'hispashtusay ba'ela misayfa ela mad sayfa. And the extension of the light was from one end of the world to the other. She bechinas midas chesed, and this is kindness, right? In other words, he's saying light was created on the first day because the first day God was expressing his kindness, and light has qualities of kindness, just like the sweet apple has qualities of kindness, right? Light has qualities of kindness. Light is from above to below, in general, shines from above to below, and it extends forever, right? It keeps going, it keeps on extending. And these two things are, if you study the Kabbalah, traits of the divine kindness. I don't want to get into that too much, but these are traits of the divine kindness, right? And the truth is that on the first day of creation, it was an infinite light, because that's what he means when he says it extended from one end of the world, really the universe, to the other. Because it says that the first day, the light that was created on the first day is not the light that we have now. Right? Because it was a light that was created before any luminaries, before the sun and the moon and the stars, right? What was the source of the light? It just says light. It doesn't say what the source of the light was.
That's the debate.
Right, exactly. The debate of where the light comes from and the nature of the light. But we are taught that the light shone from one end of the universe to the other. In other words, this light had a certain infinite quality about it. It had a quality of infinitude, right? Which is a different way of saying that the light was limited this is really true of the creations on all the days of the creation, if you go through and learn about them, they're all limited to being only what they are. In other words, they are limited by the divine traits exactly in the manner we've been discussing. Light has one nature, and the firmament dividing the higher waters from the lower waters, which is created on the second day, which comes from Gvura, that we're going to read about in a moment, has a different nature. Light has one nature. It's created on the first day because of Chesed. The second day, there's Gvura, there's the divine severity, the opposite of kindness, and is created a totally different nature of creation because on the second day there's a different divine trait. The Alter Rebbe's main point being that the differing natures, the multiplicity in the creation, derives from the differences in the divine traits, right? That from the creation's perspective, that's where all multiplicity comes from, all differences come from. Right? But the Alter Rebbe is actually saying that even though on each day we see it's the limitation of that day from the creation's perspective, that on this day was created a thing with one nature and not with a different nature, right? It's a kindness day rather than a severity day, which shows the limitation of the creation. Nevertheless, because all of these things came from God directly in the 6 days of creation, right? Because they were all expressions of God and clearly expressions of God at the moment of creation, they all still have a nature of the infinite about them, right? In other words, the light is finite because it's light and not chickens, right? It's a defined thing. That's what makes it finite. And yet, in a sense, the light is infinite because it shines from one side of the universe to the other. It's said that when by the light of the first day, you could see all of history in a glance. Right? This was a light that the quality of the light was to reveal everything in all of space and all of time. Right.
That first creation was not a physical creation.
The light, it's hard to say, right? It's hard to really understand what it's talking about. If it was a physical creation, then we follow what it says in all the Mefarshim, which is that this light was hidden away for the times of Mashiach. If it is physical, then we have not experienced it. If it's physical, it will be revealed again in Mashiach's times. But all of the things created in the story of creation, in Genesis, in Bereshis, in the 6 days of creation, each one of them is finite in terms of being a defined thing, but each of it is also infinite and reflects a certain nature of the infinite because in its extension and its quality and the way that it is. But anyway, that's really a side point, that it's also infinite. So let's turn to page 966 then. Continues the Alter Rebbe, Rak mipnei sheklula gam midas hagvura. It is only because it included within it the trait of severity. Therefore, it was not as spiritual as the actual divine light, the light that is above, literally, right? In other words, by what function, by what action does God make that the creation should have a different perspective from God? Right?
Nothing is eternal. Everything that it creates is eternal.
No. But how? How does he take, right? Because what we're saying is that God has these divine traits, which are really not different from one another. They're really just a pure expression of his infinitude, totally undefined, right? Mm-hmm. Those traits, he somehow makes with them a perspective of a creation, and from the creation's perspective, they are therefore finite. Right? How does he take this thing, which is truly, in truth, a pure, infinite expression of himself, and make from it something finite, right? There's a hint given by the Alter Rebbe here. The Alter Rebbe hints to it. He says it's because of his kalalus. It's because of things, the inter-inclusion of the spheres. It's because the divine kindness on the first day of creation is not pure kindness, right? Where is there pure kindness? In Kabbalah, what we say, only in the world of Tehu, in the world of chaos, is there true, pure kindness without any anti-kindness mixed in. In our reality, in the world that God has created, everything is inter-included. There is no white without a little bit of black. There's no black without a little bit of white. There's no good without a little bit of evil, etc., etc. Our world is a world of mixtures and balances. And the divine balance, the highest form of balance, is called hiskalalus. is called the inter-inclusion of the divine traits. The fact that the divine kindness is not just kindness, but includes within it the severity of kindness, the knowledge of kindness, the wisdom of kindness, the will of kindness. Each one of the 10 is made up and comprised of the other 10. And as we've spoken of in this class, it doesn't just stop at one layer, it continues infinitely. So each one of those 10 things that makes up kindness is itself made of 10. And each one of those 10 is also made of 10, right? And so on and so on and so on. This is called the inter-inclusion of the spheres, the hiskalalus of the divine traits. The way that the divine traits are all interwoven and intermixed and comprised of each other, right? And the Alter Rebbe is saying that because the kindness with which God created on the first day, right, was not pure kindness, but was rather kindness as it is comprised of all the other traits, therefore the result of the first day is not an infinite expression of God's light. The result of the first day is a physical light of some sort, as is described in the Torah, right? So in other words, what results in the perspective of the creation, what results in the separate perspective from Hashem, the process whereby this happens is through the inter-inclusion of the divine traits, right? It is because this infinite expression of God, so to speak, is somehow woven into itself, is somehow comprised of this sort of tapestry of all these different natures, everything is composed of everything else. Out of this fact emerges the multiplicity and the division of the creation, right? A different way of putting this, if that's all very abstract, which is understandable. Another way of putting this is that God sees all of the traits as an infinite expression of Him Himself. But why do we limit infinitude to oneness? Why should infinitude be limited to oneness? There are other forms of infinitude, and one of the other forms of infinitude is hiskalalus. The spheres, God's kindness, right, as kindness, not as wisdom, right, itself contains everything. God's kindness by itself contains all the other divine traits, right, in an infinite way.
No, in a limited way.
In infinite and infinite ranks, all the other traits exist within Chesed. In other words, God's infinite expression is still going on, even in the finite expression of the spheres. God's infinite expression, right? We said because the divine traits are God's infinite expression, all the divine traits are really the same with one another, right? Chesed is the same as Chochmah, kindness is the same as wisdom, because there's no real way to be mechalik. There's no real way to make a difference between them, because all they each are is the infinite expression of Hashem.
That's why they're one.
Well, that's why they're one, right? Now what the Alter Rebbe is saying, so how out of this oneness can multiplicity arise? And the answer is because that oneness is so one and so infinite that infinitude can be expressed in an infinite number of ways. That infinitude is so one and so infinite that it can be expressed in an infinite number of ways. How do we see that from our perspective? In the hiskalalus of the spheres, in the way that all the 10 divine traits are included one within the other. Not that they're the same. It's not that Chesed and Gvura are the same, but it's that if you look at what God's kindness is from the creation's perspective, again, from our perspective, what you will find is all the other divine traits are within it. Right? In other words, that infinitude which is above being defined in any one of the 10 traits, that infinitude is found in each one of the 10 traits. God's kindness cannot be defined just as kindness. If you really look at God's kindness as it creates light on the first day, in other words, if you were a Kabbalist and you had a sensitive soul and you really looked at the nature of the light that was created on the first day, what would you find there? Not the definition of kindness, of the God's kindness. You would find that God's kindness is defined in terms of all of God's other traits. Right? You can't understand God's kindness without also understanding God's severity, right? Because without God's severity, as it says here, there would be no physical light. There would be only spiritual light, right? And you can't understand that severity without understanding God's mercy and God's wisdom and God's will, right? All of these things are inter-included. There is no understanding any one without understanding all the others to an infinite extent, right? And what that means, Kabbalistically speaking, right? What this idea of hiskalalus, of the inter-inclusion means, is that even from the perspective of the creation, even when those divine traits become separated into 10 distinct things, right? If we were really able to see those 10 distinct things, we would see that all of those 10 things are one, right? The divine infinitude in which they are all, so there's actually, so in other words, let's put it this way. The spheres are an expression of the divine infinitude. That infinitude has a higher frequency and a lower frequency. That infinitude has a higher expression and a lower expression. The higher expression is as an infinite, indivisible oneness. The lower expression of the same thing, again, it's one thing, just two different ways of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is as infinite ranks of a tapestry, of inter-included things, of diversity and multiplicity, that within the balance of all multiplicities, that same infinitude is expressed. That exact same infinitude, which is one and indivisible, is expressed within the balance of all multiplicities. And this is the hint in Tanya, right? You could study this concept your whole life. But that's the hint in Tanya that the Alter Rebbe is saying here of how you can go from an infinite oneness of Hashem to the multiplicity of the 10 traits. How can they both be the same thing? The answer is that in one sense it's a contradiction. But in a different sense, it's not a contradiction. In a different sense, the finite can express the infinite, right? There is an infinitude even within the finite. There is it's an infinitude of largeness rather than an infinitude of smallness, right? You would put it mathematically with a very coarse metaphor. You would say it's the way that you can find infinity by keeping on adding more, and you can find infinity by looking at the distance between 0 and 1. Between 0 and 1, there's also an infinity. Right? A different type of infinity, right? But it's still infinite. There's still an infinity there, right? It's an infinity on a different scale. It's an infinity in a different way.
It's an infinity on the number.
Right. It's an infinity. It's infinite. It's infinitely divisible, right? Exactly what we are saying about the divine chesed.
But there may be another metaphor. So if you think of light being sort of the aggregation of all these different wavelengths.
Yeah.
And you could have many, all the possible different wavelengths. And I don't know what that would amount to, depending on the weighting, the color that we would see. But you can have a single source of light.
Right.
And then you could have the light itself, appears to us.
Right, but the thing is that those, I don't see how it works because those wavelengths are still distinguishable, right? As they're still finite.
No, from our perspective, they are, but not from God's perspective.
Oh. Okay, sure. From God's perspective, there's no distinguishing. Everything is one. That's basically what we're saying, right? From God's perspective, everything is one. Absolutely. So all of the multiplicity is really from our perspective. But how does multiplicity arise from that oneness? Right? How is one thing, essentially, which is the divine traits, the grounds both for absolute unity and all the multiplicity in the world? And the answer is that it's two different ways of expressing the divine infinity. That's like the bridge, so to speak. That's hinted to here in Tanya. It's two different ways of expressing the divine infinity. Therefore, from God's perspective, right, it can all just be absolutely one, because he only sees his infinitude, right? Whereas from our perspective, when we see it, we see differences in things. But what the Alter Rebbe is saying is that in those differences themselves, through inter-inclusion, through balance, you could still see, if you dug into it, you could still see that infinitude. In other words, the truth is that even from our perspective, there's traces of this inner unity of all things. That even we are able to see it if we know how to find it in the hiskalalus, in the inter-inclusion. Anyway, continues the Alter Rebbe. V'gam nislavish be'elam hazeh, on the third line of 966, shu b'chinas gvul v'tachlis, which is defined and limited. Shu mahalech tach kuf shana me'aretz l'rakiyah me'mizrach l'mayrav. Right, the light became so finite that it was enclosed in this world, which is a limited and finite world, because the distance from the earth to the heavens is 500 years. I don't know what that means, and so too from east to west, etc. As the Gemara says. I don't know what that means. Go study it there. So that's chesed, right? We see how on the first day of creation, it was a limited expression, limited trait of God. Chesed, defined, finite trait of God, produced something with a certain nature, which is light. Then on the second day of creation, Nigalis Midas HaGvura was revealed, the trait of divine severity, the trait of discipline, authority, withholding. Klula Mishar Midas also, it was also expressed as interweaving and inter-inclusion of all the divine traits, etc. Ubarabar Rakian, what did he create on the second day? The firmament, which is a mysterious creation that I do not claim to fully understand. Let there be a firmament within the water, and it separates the waters above, the higher waters from the lower waters. Again, I don't know what that means. The higher waters are certainly spiritual, right? As the Alter Rebbe is about to say. This is the separation, right? Multiplicity is itself concealment of God and severity, divine self-withholding. To conceal the higher spiritual waters from the lower waters. And thereby the lower waters could become physical, by being separated from the higher waters. Fine. And what he wants to show, and he says, Umidas ha-chesed kulaba. Just as Gvura was included in the first day, Chesed is included in the second day. Each day contains its opposite trait, right? Ki elam chesed yibana, for the world is founded on kindness, right? Shakol kadesh dira yabasha, v'adam alei alav edas havaya. The entire purpose of separating the waters was in order to eventually create the dry land, and the man upon it should serve God. In other words, even this Gvura was for a purpose of Chesed. Even the severity was for a purpose of kindness. Just as the kindness of the first day was tempered by Gvura, the ore was limited and physicized, the light was limited and physicized, so too on the second day, the expression of severity, division, making the world physical, was itself an expression of the divine kindness, right? Again, this theme of the hiskalalus, this theme of these things become separate, but not really. They become separate and defined, but even their definitions are infinite. They contain within them this infinite experience of all the traits of Hashem. V'chein kulan, says the Alter Rebbe, and so too all of them, so too all of the days. All of the days of creation. Yeah.
Are they just earthly firmaments, or?
No, clearly the firmament in the Alter Rebbe's reading here is something spiritual. I don't know what the firmament is exactly. I have no idea. I don't really understand the entire, frankly to me, the entire Parsha of Bereshis every year is like a whole new mystery. I discover 70,000 new things a year that I don't understand, and I study maybe one thing I try and understand a little bit if I can. Very, very mysterious Parshas. Until Lech Lecha, the Torah is full of mysteries. The truth is, even after Lech Lecha, right? The reason Hashem fills it full of explicit mysteries is to let you know how much of a dumbbell you are that you don't see the mysteries the rest of the time, right?
Well, just the words, in the beginning, whatever that means.
Sure. The truth is that the words in the beginning, it doesn't even, in the beginning is not even the correct translation of the words. That's also true. It's very, very tricky. Tricky stuff. Okay, in conclusion, in other words, this marks the end of three chapters of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah on one long theme, right? Maybe 4, 7, 8, 9. I think the end of 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all on one theme. The theme is divine simplicity, right? The way that God is absolutely simple, right? The question is how can he be simple if he has all he can be defined even by his own traits, right? His traits are emanated from him and express him, right? Even though he is infinitely removed from them and separate from them, right? That's the mystery of the divine traits, that something finite expresses something infinite. And the truth is that this is something we understand on faith, something that we truly do not understand. So, is his wisdom wisdom? Is the divine wisdom wisdom, or is it just godliness? Right? Is the question.
You said you're going to answer this week.
What?
Last week you said you're going to answer this.
I don't remember that. Am I being tricked? Is his wisdom wisdom, or is it just godliness? And the answer is it depends who you ask, right? From God's perspective, his wisdom is just godliness. From the creation's perspective, the wisdom is wisdom. Right?
The same wisdom that we, in the same terms?
What?
In the same way we see...
Certainly more in the same way than the way he sees it. Let's put it that way. When he looks at his wisdom, what does he see?
Godliness.
Right? The same thing that he sees when he looks at his kindness, by the way. What does he see? He sees that Hashem's infinite self can be expressed in infinite ways. That's what he sees. When you ask God, what is your wisdom? He says, all I see when I look at what you call my wisdom is that my infinite self can be expressed in infinite ways. That's all that my wisdom is. My wisdom is one of the infinite expressions of myself. That's all my wisdom is. Just as my kindness is, right? The creations, on the other hand, experience his traits as they are. We experience wisdom as wisdom, not as a mere infinite expression of Hashem. We experience his kindness as his kindness, not a mere infinite expression of Hashem. To us, there is a difference between light and a firmament. There's a difference between something that is bitter and something that is sweet. An irreducible difference, right? These two things are fundamentally have different natures. They're fundamentally different realities, right? So in conclusion, when we say that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, which is really what set off this whole 3-chapter long conversation, right? When we say that he is the knower, the knowledge, and the known, what we are saying is that his wisdom is not a contradiction to him, right? It's also not identical with him, right? His wisdom does not contradict him. His wisdom is also not identical with him. What is his wisdom when we say the knower, the knowledge, and the known? God and his wisdom are absolutely one. What do we mean? We mean that he emanates something that is defined as wisdom, and yet that defined thing is able to convey the undefined infinite nature of Hashem. That's what this phrase means in Chassidus. In Chassidus, in the Alter Rebbe's definition, the knower, the knowledge, and the known means that there is something called the divine knowledge, which is defined as knowledge, right? At least from the creation's perspective, right? It is the same thing. Again, it's vitally important to remember. When we say God's perspective and the creation's perspective, we mean two perspectives on the same thing, not two different things, God forbid. That would make this whole exercise totally unnecessary. The whole point is that it's the same thing, right? That God has something called his wisdom. That wisdom we perceive as irreducibly finite, as having a particular nature, right? That thing with a particular nature conveys God who is beyond being defined by any nature, right? And this contradiction is the nature of a single thing, called God's wisdom. God's wisdom is, from his perspective, totally infinite and a pure infinite expression of himself. And from our perspective, a defined expression called the divine wisdom. The difference between, this is really just a doorway that we're passing in the hall, right? We're not going to walk through it, but there's a whole other way of talking about the divine unity, which we've touched on in this class before, right? A whole other series of metaphors and a whole different mind space to get into, right? Which makes the following metaphor. It says, from God's perspective, he's like King Solomon, right? King Solomon, we say about him, that he had 3,000 mashalim, 3,000 metaphors, right? The Rebbeim are always careful to specify. We don't mean he had 3,000 metaphors for 3,000 different things. We mean he had 3,000 metaphors. He was so wise that to convey his wisdom to the simplest person, he needed 3,000 levels of metaphors. Not 3,000 metaphors for 3,000 different things. For each one thing that he knew, each one wise idea, he would make a metaphor, but that metaphor wouldn't be low enough for people to understand. So he would make another metaphor and another metaphor. 3,000 levels of metaphors. King Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, needed to speak to regular people. Right? So God is like King Solomon. Right? He sees in his 3,000th metaphor, right, from his perspective, he sees in his 3,000th metaphor that all 3,000 metaphors are really just the same thought, just keeping on moving, right? The same thought traveling to a different place, to a different context, but it's exactly the same thought. To him, it's not really 3,000 different things, right? To him, it's all just the thought, as the thought expresses in this manner, and in this manner, and in this manner, and in this manner, right? As it goes further and further down, as it becomes more and more simple, more and more coarse, more and more physically defined, right? To the extent that a simple person can understand it, right? But to him, it's all one idea. Right? This is what it's like when God looks at his chachma. He doesn't see the chachma is like the divine wisdom is like the 3,000th metaphor. Right? When God sees the divine wisdom, he doesn't see what the simple person sees. When the simple person looks at the 3,000th metaphor, right, he sees a story about a king and a prince that get lost in the forest and go picking apples or whatever it is, right? That's what the simple person sees in the 3,000th level. And if the simple person doesn't know that it's a metaphor, he'll just take it for what it is, right? He'll say, oh, there was a king and a prince, and he's thinking literally physical thoughts. He doesn't know that there's a whole world behind this idea, right? He doesn't know that this...
Doesn't know the poetry.
What?
Doesn't know the poetry.
He doesn't know the poetry, exactly. He's taking everything literally, right? He's Amelia Bedelia. He takes everything 100% literally. King Solomon tells him to hit the road, and he shows up with a stick and starts hitting the pavement, right? That's the simple person. So when the creation sees the divine chachma, the divine wisdom, right? We see the most external layer. We see the 3,000th metaphor. Right? This metaphor is conveying the idea, but it's conveying it in a way that because we are what we are, we're so distant from the original idea that we perceive this thing as its own story, as its own reality, right? Which says, I am wisdom and not kindness, right? When Solomon sees the 3,000 metaphors, does he distinguish between the 2,999th metaphor and the 3,000th? Do they really have two different natures? They're two different offshoots of the same thing. They're the idea. They're just the idea as fully expressed, right? The idea in one spectrum. All Solomon does is say the idea. The fact that there's 3,000 different steps is the problem of people who are not as smart as Solomon. Everything becomes divided into different levels of understanding. I can only understand up to the first three metaphors, but I can't understand the fourth, right? So King Solomon, these divisions are meaningless, right? These divisions are, to him, it's just, I just said the idea. That's all I did, right? So too, when God sees his chachma, all he sees is, I shone forth my infinite presence. I expressed my infinite self, right? When the creation sees it, it sees the divisions, it sees the differences, right? That's a different metaphor for the same idea, and this metaphor is elaborated on in great length elsewhere in Chassidus. It's the same question, by the way. It's the same idea, a different metaphor, although this metaphor is not very useful because it's completely inconceivable. But it's the same idea as our good old friend. The space of the ark does not have any measure, right? Makam ha'aron eina min hamidah. It's the same. It's the same idea, right? You place the ark in the Holy of Holies, and you measure the ark and you measure the room, and you realize that the measure of the ark doesn't take up any space in the room, right? So the question is does the ark take up space or does it not take up space? And the answer is, it depends how you look, right? It depends from whose perspective. If you're smart enough to measure the whole room once you've measured the ark, right, you realize that this space of the ark only exists to convey that there is no limitation of space. If you make the proper measurement and look at the whole situation from the higher perspective, you realize that the only reason the ark takes up space is so God can express how space is meaningless, how space is immaterial. There is no limitation of space. Things don't need to take up space, right? But if you only measure the ark, right, if you only come and measure the box and never come to measuring the room, right, then what do you conclude? You conclude space is real. Right? Not only is it real, but it exists, it seems, as an end unto itself. Space exists, and it just exists. It's the law of reality. Right? In other words, if you don't measure the room, if you don't come from the higher perspective, if you don't see the whole situation, right, you think that space, you come away with the conclusion space is absolutely real. If you see the whole situation, you see that space exists only to convey what is above space. The finite exists only as a conveyance for the infinite. There is no true finitude. Finitude is just a means of the infinite expressing itself. Right? Same idea. So the only contradiction between space and above space, between finite and infinite, right, is really from our end. We see the finite and the infinite, right? Chachma and the lamayla min chachma. Wisdom and what infinitely transcends wisdom. To us, this is a contradiction. To God, it's the most natural thing in the world. To God, wisdom is merely a means by which what is above wisdom is expressed. We cannot understand this. We cannot understand from our perspective, because we are created, we cannot solve this contradiction. This is a pure contradiction to us, that what is wisdom and what is infinitely above wisdom are really the same thing. From God's perspective, right, there is no problem at all with this unity.
So the Mashiach will be able to grasp this?
The Pashtus, yes. Because when Mashiach comes, Mashiach comes, God himself will be present in everything. Right? We will see.
Be seen.
Exactly. God himself will be seen in absolutely everything, even within all finitude and within all limitation. Right? Which is really...
But then why would you need Mashiach to come?
What do you mean?
And if God's going to be there...
What do you mean?
Well, if Mashiach comes, and God also comes...
God is here.
Why do you
will just be visible?
I'm not sure I really understand the question.
Visible,
you mean why does
Mashiach?
No, that's like saying if I really believe in God, why do I need to read in the Sefer Torah? I have God. It's the same question.
No, that's then and that's.
That was then. This is now, but it's the same idea. In other words, you're talking about Mashiach as if him and God are competing issues, right? That's actually, ironically, thinking about Mashiach in the terms of the world that we're describing here, right? You're saying the infinite and the finite contradict. Our whole point is that when Mashiach comes, the infinite and the finite will be absolutely unified. Right? The infinite and the finite, on the contrary, the person of Mashiach will be seen to be nothing other than a pure expression of the infinite God. In the Mashiach way, right? In other words, it's not that Chachma and Chesed will disappear and there will just be God when Mashiach comes. Then there was no purpose of having Chachma and Chesed in the first place. The divisions between things will exist, but we will see them the way God sees them now. That the divisions are themselves just expressions of the infinite, right? Which we cannot really fully comprehend now. So in other words, the distinction between Mashiach and God when Mashiach comes, on the contrary, will not be so obvious or so simple.
So we'll have a better understanding of the interconnectedness.
Of course. We'll have a true understanding of the interconnectedness.
Complication.
What do you mean?
Because because take food.
Yeah.
You suddenly see the godliness in it, so you don't want to eat.
On the contrary, because God's will is that we eat the food. The food exists to be eaten. It's the fact that we could see the food as anything other than to be eaten for, in a sense, that conceals an aspect of godliness, right? Or that we can see non-kosher food as being as edible as kosher food. Which actually brings me to my next point, which is that the Torah command, which is the Torah's commands, which are the wisdom of God, right? The Torah is the wisdom of God. We keep bringing it back to Torah because when you say that the wisdom of God is Torah, it makes everything much more tangible in these discussions, because we sometimes forget what we mean even when we say the wisdom of God. So the Torah commands, right, to not eat. The Torah commands us not to eat arla, right, which is the fruit of the tree for the first 3 years. You're not supposed to eat, right? Then you have the 4th year, which is revius. Long story short, the first few years that the tree is around, you're not meant to eat from it, right? The first 3 years of the orla, you don't eat the fruit of the tree. So I place before you an apple. Let's say I somehow managed to preserve it. I don't know how. I froze it or something. But I have an apple from the 3rd year, from the same tree. In fact, from the same branch of the same tree. I have an apple. One is from the 3rd year, and one is from the 5th year, right, or the 4th year, right? I have 2 apples from the same tree, from the same branch, and they're absolutely different, right? They're absolutely distinct in the way that the Torah deals with them, right? Now, when we look at the Torah says that these 2 things are different, right? We see the Torah as irreducibly a work of seichel, a work of intellect, right? We see the Torah as irreducibly chachma. In other words, we cannot see we cannot see the way that the Torah is fundamentally different than any other wisdom. In other words, the Torah tells us A is permitted and B is forbidden, right? This seems to be in the class of any other type of wisdom, right? The Torah says, U.S. law says that A is forbidden and B is permitted and B is forbidden, lahavdil, right? We see the Torah as being wisdom, and irreducibly wisdom. And even if we can understand it as divine wisdom, right, which is as high as we can go, as creations, right, it's still to us irreducibly wisdom. That's still the type of thing it is. The Torah is still more similar to American jurisprudence than to American, pick something, American car culture. It's more similar to the seichel, to the laws, than it is to anything else, right? It's irreducibly seichel. From God's perspective, what does He see? He sees that the Torah is not just chachma. The Torah is simply part of His infinite expression, right? The same quality as all other things, right? Is all part of His infinite expression. Right, as all other types of things, as kindness and as severity. So in other words, what's a different way of putting this? A different way of putting this is that when we Well, let's put it this way. Why do we learn in the Torah things like the Tanya? Why do we learn things that we can't understand? Right? We're learning about God, and all the time we're saying this is something that we can't understand, right? In a sense, here at the end of chapter 10, the Alter Rebbe justifies his own project. The Alter Rebbe justifies his own goal. He says that our mind's conceptions of God, no matter how limited they may be, right? No matter how small our chachma, no matter how small our intellect, right? When we are thinking the words of Torah and struggling to understand them and usually failing, when we are struggling to understand the wisdom of God, our small wisdoms are not nothing, right? Our small wisdoms, our parts of the Torah that we can grasp, right, are not nothing. If they were just intellect, if they were just understanding, if they were just part of seichel, they would be nothing, right? They would be an independent reality, totally separate from the infinitude of God. They would be something finite, right? And finite things round down to nothing, right? But because the Torah is absolutely unified with the infinite expression of Hashem, right? Even the struggle to understand and the very, very tiny bit that we do understand, right? Our mind is united with the infinite expression of Hashem. Hashem is infinitely present in that aspect of the Torah that we understand. And then, when we go and we eat the non-orla apple, instead of the orla apple, what do? We take that wisdom of Hashem and we draw it into even the physical reality. We draw it into the physical reality of the world, right? And we are essentially declaring that even what is below Torah, even the world as it's separate from Hashem, right, is not really separate. Even the world as it's separate from Hashem is also just an expression of an infinite expression from that infinite place. And therefore, this is really therefore, when we do Torah and mitzvahs, we bring Mashiach closer. Because what else is Mashiach other than the seeing the infinite expression of Hashem that is above all finitude within the finite world itself, right? In other words, this is the whole point of so to speak, the whole point of the Torah, so you can't say such things, but the whole point of having the divine wisdom and learning the divine wisdom is not to learn a wisdom, right? It is to smuggle the infinite presence of Hashem into our reality, because wherever the Torah is, no matter how qualified, finite, or purely intellectual it may seem, wherever the Torah is, both intellectually and through mitzvahs physically and in enacting the Torah, so to speak, right? Wherever the Torah goes is the infinite presence of Hashem. So Mashiach, as the culmination of Ma'asenu v'Avodesenu Kol Meshach Zman HaGolus, right? The Mashiach as the culmination of everything that we do in all of our worship of God in the time of the exile, right, is a realization of fully, a culmination, bringing Hashem fully into this reality. This is essentially the project of Judaism. So what are these last three chapters, chapters 8, 9, and 10 of the Alter Rebbe's Shaar HaYichud ve'Emunah tell us? What they tell us is that when we access the Torah and we bring it into a place, right, we are bringing God, who is infinite and simple and totally beyond the apparent limitations of whatever it is that we're doing, right? And even if we cannot understand how the infinite God is in this finite thing, that is nevertheless its nature, and it's holy, and it's special, and it's godly in a way that is truly beyond comprehension. That's essentially the message. And this is about Hashem's simplicity, right? And how that simplicity can be found and be brought out in even the finitude, limitation, and complexity of the world, which is really the point of this whole discussion. Again, we see the repeated theme of Shaar HaYichud ve'Emunah, which is that Hashem is much closer than we think He is the repeated theme, right? Hashem is much closer than we think it is. The first 7 chapters were really about the world and about how the world is nothing and we live within godliness. And chapters 8, 9, and 10 were really about Torah, and about how Torah, right, is not a contradiction to Hashem's unity, and on the contrary, when we bring Torah into this reality, we change it from being, it's already nothing within godliness, but we change it from being a nothing before God to being one with God, right, which is really the purpose of all creation. Let's read, just if you'll permit me, I know we're way over, let's just read the last few lines here, so we finish the chapter. Page 968. This is what Eliyahu says in the Tikkunim. The purpose of the spheres is to show how the world is conducted with righteousness and justice. Tzedek iu din, righteousness is law, in other words, gvura. Mishpat iu rachami, and mishpat, justice, is mercy. All of which is to show how the world is conducted. But it is not that you have a knowable righteousness which is gvura, nor knowable justice which is mercy. You are not of any of these other attributes at all. In other words, these attributes as separate things, right, do not really convey godliness. It is only by seeing beyond these separate and defined things, right, that we see Hashem himself. Or alternatively, right, as we hinted to, and as will God willing continue in further chapters, in the way that the spheros are woven together. Those are the two options. Either we go beyond the difference between chesed and gvura to see how they are just the infinite expression of Hashem, which really only Hashem can do and we can only see when Mashiach comes. Or, if you want to look in his gvura and chesed, right, if you want to look in his opposing traits as they are in the world right now, you can see how they're one, but only in their hiskalalus, in the way that they're balanced and woven together, and that conveys the infinitude of Hashem, as we will continue more, God willing, next week.